My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, to get us kind of started here, for our listeners who may not be super familiar with you or your work, can you talk a little bit about how you came to be in the content creation world?
I guarantee everyone out there has seen my work and not even known it was mine. The video that launched me into internet stardom was a video called Squirrel Steals GoPro, Carries It Up a Tree. 2014, November 2014, where I had gotten a GoPro and I was tinkering around with playing with the GoPro. And one day in November, I put a little piece of bread on a GoPro, taped it to the GoPro. A squirrel came, picked it up, carried the GoPro up a tree. I uploaded it to the internet and it got like 5 million views in a week. And then I discovered video licensing. I discovered that you could make AdSense revenue on YouTube. And that's how I started creating content for the internet. Creating quirky random videos turned into drone videos, cooking videos, family videos. And eventually I niched down into law just because I was still a practicing lawyer. And every now and again, I'd put up a video, a day in the life of a lawyer. People liked it. And I said, do more of this. And then I started doing more of that. And one day I did an analysis of the Alex Jones deposition in the Sandy Hook defamation, intentional infliction of emotional stress cases. That went quasi-viral. I discovered my niche, and sort of the rest is history.
Wow, that is fascinating. And so, how did you find to blend YouTube and lawyer content creation? That's such a niche, like a branch of the internet. So, how did your following grow, and kind of what did you find your listeners were interested in learning about?
So it's funny because to get to 50,000 subs doing random, I don't know if you know who Casey Neistat is, but I was doing like random family cooking stuff, editing stuff. And when I decided to wind down the law practice, because I couldn't stand the practice of law anymore, I did like 2 years of video a day. And so, it would be whatever was happening in the day, I would do a video about. I was still practicing part-time. I had a few clients left. And so when those days would come up, I'd say, okay, I'm going to do a video about prepping a witness, about, preparing for court. And those videos, people always had an interest in those videos. And then I discovered that, in as much as I had over a decade of practice, legal experience, and then I had, years of editing experience, social media, I realized that this was the niche that I had, the four things I could add to the world. I knew what I was doing. The world needed a little bit of that interpretation. You can make a little money doing it. And there's a fourth element to this. But it was a niche that had not yet been fully saturated on YouTube. And so there were a few others doing it. A guy named Legal Eagle, who's probably on the opposite end of the political spectrum. And I started in, operating in this niche. There were a few other lawyers operating in it, but it blossomed. I went from 50,000 to 100,000 real quick, 100,000 to 200,000 even quicker. And as COVID progressed, then, everyone was locked down and that the people were on the internet day in and day out. And that's really when things exploded. But it was just discovering video editing, communication, legal analysis, political commentary, and LawTube. I became a member of what we now refer to as LawTube.
That is amazing. And so you now kind of offer analysis of current events from like a legal lens. So how do you balance providing this type of insight while also keeping the content accessible for the general audience who knows nothing about legality and legal practice?
It's easy enough to keep it accessible. You have to just assume that people don't know what you might think or presume other people know because you know it yourself. So, oftentimes it's repetitive. You just say, okay, you're talking about injunctions. You go and repeat the criteria for injunctions, explain legal terms that other people take for granted. People might just know when they typically won't know. And then repetition, just, even if it means saying the same stuff, not over and over again, but in different videos, just remind people of what the legal concepts are. The tougher thing than breaking it down for in a way that people can understand is breaking it down in a way that's interesting, insightful, and that doesn't overwhelm them with your own opinion. I've realized it's unavoidable and almost not disingenuous, but it does lack transparency to not let your audience know what you think, because that might impact how they view your analysis, but it might also impact your analysis. And so, you learn how to break things down, you learn how to make things entertaining and engaging. And now I've gotten to the point where not only am I not afraid to share my own personal opinion on the subjects, I think I have a moral and ethical obligation to my audience to do so transparently so they can assess with whatever biases they think I may have or whatever biases I do in fact have.
That's super important. And so you entered into a content deal with Rumble. Can you talk a little bit about how you made that transition from a fully independent content creator to now somebody who's contracted with a pretty major independent news platform, from my understanding?
Oh yeah, well, it's actually once back in the day. I mean, it's still more than just say content. I along with Robert Barnes was helping actually and still do consult with the terms of service, drafting their terms of service, uh, rules of the game, and applying them with my Canadian expertise in law and my partner-in-law's expertise in American law. And so we had helped and draft with Rumblebee terms of service, applied them so that it would actually be a platform uh, that had certain not rules, but that had rules that were clear and applicable to the content creator population, so that people would not complain about opaque, arbitrary application of the rules, which was the problem on YouTube. And so uh, did some of that, and then signed an exclusive agreement where we were basically saying it's time for the world to move away from YouTube, because YouTube engages in sometimes soft censorship, sometimes hard censorship, and it's not what it was 10 years ago, or now more than 10 years ago, an open platform for open ideas. It's curated, it's censored, it's curtailed. And so this opportunity with Rumble came up where I had actually already started analyzing some of the lawsuits involving Rumble. They were suing Google. There were a number of interesting legal things going on with the platform of Rumble. And that's how I discovered Chris Pavlovsky. That's how they discovered me. And we entered into this agreement, which has turned into something amazing, got me down to Florida, and has basically allowed me to have one of the bigger legal political podcasts, live streams, whatever you want to call it, in the world on a daily basis. And it's been the biggest blessing of my life to have actually crossed paths with Robert Barnes. We now have a Viva Barnes Law locals community, Chris Pavlovsky, and my relationship with Rumble. And I say symbiotic and mutually beneficial, I hope. But it's certainly allowed me to get down to the land of the free.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you've been a pretty big advocate for free speech, especially when it comes to the work that you've done with Rumble. So, what is your perception of the current state of free speech in Canada, maybe compared to other countries?
I've been in this, internet game for darn near a decade now, over a decade. And back in 2016, when I first started talking about the Bill C-16, which was modifying the criminal code to add gender identity as aggravating factors to hate crimes, and Jordan Peterson was saying this is going to, pave the way for compelled speech in Canada. And I was like, Dad, don't panic just yet. And I was wet behind the ears and naive and totally not cynical enough. I remember people in the chat saying, Viva, you guys have no free speech up in Canada. I'm like, well, of course we do. We can say certain things. It was nowhere near as bad as it is now. But looking back in retrospect, I don't. We've never had unbridled free speech in Canada. And some people say, well, A, you don't need it. A, it's a bad. B, it's a bad thing. And C, you don't even have it in the States. Well, setting aside the Brandenburg test for true threats, freedom of speech in America is respected as a God-given right. In Canada, it's unfortunately a privilege that the crown doesn't think the lowly subjects even deserve. And so, what's the state of free speech in Canada? It exists in the sense that you can say certain things. It exists in the sense that you don't get locked up for telling the prime minister to go F himself. But it doesn't exist in the sense that hate speech is a thing that can get you in trouble. Hate speech is a thing that can get you locked up now, literally. And you've got these administrative tribunals that are literally fining people for misgendering people. So you've got some free speech, but it's not totally free. So, I mean, what is that? It's compromised free speech, which is no free speech. But it's better than North Korea, just not as good as America.
Yeah. And given your experience in traditional media and independent platforms, what do you think needs to change in order to bring about more free speech when it comes to content creation and consumption?
Well, on the one hand, it takes companies with the courage to say we're not going to bend the knee and bend over backwards to accommodate to snowflake companies that say we don't want to advertise because we don't like the content. When Dunkin' Donuts said they didn't want to advertise on Rumble because it has too much of a right-wing conservative base, I mean, you need companies elsewhere, or you need platforms elsewhere to say, well, almost boycott those who would boycott. You need companies that are going to say, tough noogies were not bending over and bending the knee to for your ad dollars, sort of like what Elon Musk was saying, but Rumble and Chris Pavlovsky do it a little bit better. And also, you need a social shift. You need people to, basically have a parent tell them your feelings don't dictate other people's speech. My freedoms don't end where your sensitivities begin. And you need that to be understood at a cultural, social level so that people can actually reward the companies that don't impose these soft censorship type advertising methods of curbing speech. So it needs to come from basically bottom up and top down, if I sound a little bit like Kamala Harris. You need a society that is no longer a snowflake, sensitivity driven society that thinks their emotions get to dictate other people's liberties. You need companies that stand up to the advertisers, and you need advertisers who are going to say, we're not going to bend the knee either to the demands of a very vocal, but ironically enough, not even the purchasing power side of the market. And you'll see what happens eventually, and we're getting there. Free speech is going to be cool. Free speech companies are going to be the cool companies, and people are going to realize it's not because somebody is criticizing the trans movement that people don't want to advertise on that content. Horse crap. You want to be where the eyeballs are, regardless of the message. Coca-Cola running an ad on a Steven Crowder video doesn't mean that Coke embraces Steven Crowder's message any more than Cadillac in the Matrix meant that Cadillac endorsed Mr. Smith. So it's a cultural thing. It's about time for it to start shifting. I think it is in America. My only cynicism is that it doesn't seem to be taking effect in Canada. It, in fact, seems to be going the other way.
Interesting. So when it comes to freedom of speech, obviously that's a big point of concern for you, but also you've kind of talked about discrepancies between media portrayals and the on the ground realities. And I don't know if this is because they don't feel like they have the liberty to express what's actually happening online, but can you share some specific instances where you felt like the online media narrative was misleading people as to what was actually happening on the ground?
I've now lived long enough through this that I don't think it's anything new. The media has always been lying. It's always been gatekeeping. It's always been doing the bidding of the government. It's just that they've had a monopoly on the truth and they've had a monopoly on access to the truth. And so, you go back, if you haven't read the book, The Gray Lady Winks, detailing the New York Times century plus of disinformation for the benefit of the government, it's always been corrupt. And 60 Minutes has always been, to some extent, propaganda, more or less, maybe, but always been. It's just that we never knew it because until we had the democratization of the access to information that the internet allows, these people were the literal gatekeepers where people didn't even know that they were gatekeeping. Now it's totally different. It's been exposed in plain sight, at the very least, on steroids over the last decade. Concrete examples, there is no more concrete example than the Ottawa trucker protest in Canada. And how you had legacy media, state-funded propaganda from the government out there spreading lies, like overt, outright, egregious lies. So much so that people are like, okay, I'm hearing it's a right-wing extremist. They're desecrating statues and running around with Nazi flags. It's such a radical departure from the truth that people say no one would lie like that and think they'd get away with it, but yet they do. And when I got down there specifically for the purposes of just contrasting reality with what we were being told, it might have overlapped. It might have been the same thing. It was, like I said with James O'Keefe recently, it was the inverse of reality. That was the most prime example for me. But Nicholas Sandman, the Covington kids in America, what the media was portraying was the inversion of the truth. January 6th, what the media portrayed was the inversion of the truth. And they've always been doing it. They've just always been getting away with it until the lowly plebs have had access to unbridled information on the internet, which is specifically and exactly why the governments of the world are going so hard after the internet, because it's now the wild west of where people actually get information from, and they don't like to have their power and their monopoly challenged.
Yep, you can't hide things anymore from people on the internet. The internet is forever.
You get Jacinda Ardern saying, no, no, you
Yep.
better come to the government websites because that's where you get the truth. That's a terrible accent. But
Mm.
the government telling you to go to them for the truth. When has that ever been true, and when has that ever worked out well? So you understand what the war on the internet is based on.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to do like a 360 turn here, but since we're talking about political events in the US and Canada and kind of how the news has spun it. I'm curious to hear your take on if there was anything that surprised you about the election season, both in the US versus Canada, and if you have any insight as to how that was maybe correctly or incorrectly portrayed to the public.
Well, I called it on both, by the way. I called Trump, I called
Good for
Biden
you.
actually tanking during the debate. I called Pierre Poilievre blowing the election. I took flack from conservatives in Canada who were shooting the messenger, but ignoring the message. Um, no, I'm surprised how the media depiction of it. I mean, it's more of the same. Again, the gatekeepers controlling the message. In America, you had an entire machine, on the one hand, lying about Biden's competency, acumen, mental acuity. Then you had the entire media machine lying about Kamala Harris's experience, capabilities at being president. You had the alternative media, which was not just pushing back, but which was more impactful and more vocal and more accurate. You say you say Rogan as the biggest name, the Crowders, Tim Pool, Steve Bannon. I don't want to forget anybody, but I'm going to. They were the alternate voices of the alternative media that was more accurate and that allowed the people's voices to be heard. Contrast that with what was going on in Canada, where you had a media that was literally in bed with that three passport carrying globalist Mark J. Carney. And you didn't have a sufficient, substantial alternative media to put a Pierre Poilievre's message on blast, but also to operate as a pushback to the legacy media. I mean, you have Rebel News, you have True North, you have Post Millennial, you have a number of independent journalists, Mocha Bezigran. Let me think of who else. I don't want to forget anybody up in Canada. But it's just, it's not the same culture of, call it anti-media for lack of a better word. And it didn't have the impact of breaking through with the truth. There's a large portion of blame that I believe falls on Pierre Poilievre and the campaign in general. But you saw the impact, the consequences of what it means to have a robust anti-media, counter-media that you have in the States, which doesn't exist in Canada and is being actively suppressed in Canada. Because when I had people telling me they couldn't see my content or my appearance on Patrick Bet-David's podcast because they can't access Patrick Bet-David's podcast in Canada because of laws in Canada, then you understand how the media, when they control, or the government, when it controls the media, it basically doesn't control the outcome, but it definitely gets to, nudge it in the direction it wants.
Mm. So they really work very hard to silence independent voices. That is incredible.
It's wild for a non-Canadian, for anyone outside of Canada who
Yeah.
doesn't fully appreciate. I mean, I say it, it's not to gloat and it's not to berate. Canadians are among the most propagandized people on earth. I mean, right up there with, I would even dare say, like North Korea is the next level. But when you have Canadians who vastly still believe that the Ottawa trucker protest was a terrorist far right wing event and that Chris Barber and Tamara Leach deserve 7 and 8 years in jail, you realize the impact of having government control the media, CTV News, Radio Canada, Global News, CBC, City News, all of it. It's all state funded. It all pushes the same message. And Canadians, too many Canadians, don't even know that they are propagandized into submission.
Wow. And so, honestly, this is kind of a good segue into talking a little bit about kind of what we're trying to achieve here at We Unify with the Reclaiming Conference is to give a voice to those independents and to those people who are working to try to increase just public knowledge. People don't even realize, I think, what they don't know. And so, why would you say it's important to gather together in person, maybe offline, to have conversations like this face to face? Is it important to hear from people from all sides of the political spectrum on important topics like censorship and freedom of speech?
Well, I mean, meeting in person is always great. Like, you can have a live stream of 30,000 people. It doesn't have the same energy that a room of 1,000 or 2,000 people has. It certainly doesn't have the same energy as a stadium of 30,000 people. Um, it's important to, I say interact in person with people with whom you agree and especially with people with whom you disagree. But these types of events where you have people gathering together, it creates an energy and it creates sort of like, like when a star goes nova and it spreads out it's stardust across the cosmos. Something like that happens with ideas when you have these conferences. On the one hand, people are in person to agree, disagree, have conversation, but it does it creates something of an energy that has lasting effects beyond the event itself. And it's also just great to do things in person, understand that there are, we're not just living in a digital universe, that there are real people behind this and there are real life impacts of this for good and for bad, and to try to maximize those for good by spreading the message of truth and um, you know, opposing what is becoming increasing government suppression, government oppression, and government tyranny, especially in Canada.
Mm. And so, for somebody who might be a little bit on the fence about attending a conference like this, maybe they're nervous about taking a stand, so to speak, either way, why would you encourage them that it's important now, maybe more so than ever, to be educated on the topics of free speech?
Well, it's interesting. I've never, since I left my original law firm and started my own, I've never had a boss that I've ever had to contemplate, well, what are they going to think if I say something or attend a conference that they don't like? Sometimes it doesn't impact me, but you think that people have these considerations with sponsors or events. Like, I don't want to get kicked out of an event because someone doesn't like my tweet. I've never lived with that sword of Damocles over my head. I can relate to it, uh, and I can understand people's reluctance to go to events where they say, oh, if someone catches a picture of me with, let me just say, a member of Diagolon, you may or may not know what that is, but Canadians will definitely get that reference. You know, I might get fired. I might get ostracized. You have to own that. This is how the 2S LGBTQIA plus so-called trans movement got its foothold and control over people, because people say, well, it doesn't impact me and I don't want to get into a fight, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. The fight eventually comes to your door whether you like it or not. And so, you can try to placate friends and family. They're going to find out regardless, and if they're going to unfriend you for that, they weren't friends in the first place. And it goes back to like the social change that has to happen. I say courage is contagious, as is cowardice. And so you're going to pick your battle for one or the other. And it's not a question of going out and just associating with bad. I don't know. It's not a question of doing stupid things for the sake of being stupid, but live by your principles and don't let yourself get browbeaten into compromising on your morals, your principles, your convictions because of a paycheck. But I do appreciate that I'm either fortunate enough or just have never had that be a determinate consideration to compel me to do one thing or another as far as my own behavior goes.
That's fair enough. And honestly, it really is super important. I think we are past the time of being able to hang out in the gray area, and conferences like this. And honestly, what the goal is to foster conversation. And so that's really why we're trying to encourage people to come out saying, you don't have to take a stance necessarily, but at least open yourself up and be willing to learn from speakers like what you.
There's a massive liberation that comes with saying, I don't care what you think about what I think. I mean, it is absolutely the most liberating thing on earth. Where, who just said it? It was a member of the behavior panel. It's a very big group, a YouTube channel, where they said confidence comes from the willingness to accept social consequences for your beliefs. And so it's like it's liberating. If you say, I don't care if you agree or disagree with my ideas, presumably it's because you can defend them, and I can my own. And also, you can attend a conference without being tied to the ideas of everyone involved. And you can attend in a critical sense. So you always have that defense. But the bottom line, the battle comes to your front door whether you like it or not. And so you don't have to take a side in the sense of just making enemies for the sake of it. But shutting up and backing off only works so well. But like the old poem goes, it works until it doesn't. And then you just hope there's someone there to help you when it comes to your front door.
Absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. So I highly encourage you to go check out our website at weunify.ca, where you can find details about our conference taking place in Calgary, Alberta, September 19th through 21st. It's going to be imperative, super important conversations. You're not going to want to miss it. Get tickets as soon as you can. And thank you so much for your time today, David. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you here in a couple weeks.
Thank you very much.